Good morning, and thank you for joining us. Welcome to the Africa Center at the Atlantic Council. And in case you've just found the Atlantic Council on the web, we are a large Washington, D.C. based foreign policy. The Africa Center is a small corner of the Atlantic Council writ large, but an important part of the Atlantic Council. And we're very pleased to be having our inaugural live event this morning. Our purpose is to celebrate the launch of a new textbook on African security. It's called African Security: An Introduction. It's been written by Dr. Jonah Victor and Dr. John Seco, both of whom are with us this morning. John and Jonah, welcome. Can you give us a quick introduction to yourselves, please?
Jonah, fire away.
No, I mean, John and Jonah.
Hi, I'm Jonah Victor.
And Jonah, you are you frozen?
Hi, I'm Jonah Victor. I spent testing. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Hi, I'm Jonah Victor. Spent over a decade as an advisor on Africa issues in the U.S. government, including as an analyst and a policy planner. And I also taught African security issues at Georgetown University's graduate school.
Thanks very much. And John, your quick bio. Fantastic, thank you. And I know that you're a DC person by the use of the word expression IC, which is the intelligence community for those of us joining us from outside of the DC bubble. We are also really, truly delighted to have Brittany Brown from the International Crisis Group. Brittany, would you please say hello and give us a quick word?
Absolutely. Hi, I'm Brittany Brown, and I'm currently the Chief of Staff over at the International Crisis Group. Before joining Crisis Group, I was in the U.S. government for over a decade, including some time at the White House and the National Security Council working with Jonah, which is how we met, focused on Africa. And I'm excited to be here to talk with all of you.
Fantastic, me too. So before we get started, a very quick housekeeping note. If you look at the bottom center of your screen on the control panel, you'll see a Q&A button. If you use that Q&A button, you will be able to submit questions and comments to us throughout the event. We can see them, we will be reading them, and we'll be using them to guide our discussion. We may stop and take the question, or if we see a lot of commentary about Nigeria, for example, we'll just start talking about Nigeria. So this will give you an opportunity to shape the dialogue in real time. If you're joining us from Twitter, you can use the hashtag #African Security, and we will get the question via Twitter and we'll respond to it in the same way. Alrighty, one final note. If you enjoy the conversation today, you can buy this book at bloomsbury.com at a 30% discount now. Again, that's bloomsbury.com. Alrighty, let's jump in. So my first question to you, John and Jonah, why did you want to write an introduction to African security? What motivated this?
Hi, thank you. This is an introductory textbook, and it's an introduction for students. It's also an introduction to professionals, and also for the general public who might be aware of global issues and national security issues, but less aware of African issues. And although this is an introductory text and it's meant to be accessible, it's also framed with the central argument. It's really kind of a three-part argument. One, that Africa, its security problems, deserve to be studied and understood, engaged seriously and with as much rigor as those anywhere else in the world. Second of all, security problems in Africa need to be considered using a broad framework, considering the political, economic, and security dynamics, but it needs to be centered on Africa and Africans. It's easy to get distracted by what the US is doing in Africa, what China's doing, what global jihadist groups are trying to do in Africa. But really it's about African publics, African politicians, African militaries, their perspectives, their decisions. That's what needs to be considered in any good analysis and any good formulation of a response to Africa's security challenges. Africa is also, it's not fossilized in history. This is a dynamic, it's a rapidly changing continent. We've seen tremendous changes in the 2010s. We're expecting significant changes ahead in the 2020s, at the very least, demographic changes, also economic, political, social. And it's, of course, very diverse. And whether you're just looking at the 49 countries of sub-Saharan Africa, we're also including North Africa. We look at both in the book. There is a great diversity, and it's hard to make sense of all this, but we try to really help the readers zero in on sites are that they need to know. And the third part of the argument is that Africa's security problems have proven stubbornly difficult to address, and in some cases are worsening. And there are increasing consequences for global security. And this is not a call for pessimism. In fact, in the 2010s, we saw some successes in terms of resolving conflicts, solidifying peace, even counterterrorism in some instances, advancing democracy. But there's also been some really persistent problems, persistent conflicts. And, if the message is business as usual, is going to have increasing consequences into the 2020s. There's issues that should not be easily dismissed or quickly judged, but deserve serious engagement and thought behind them. Mm-hmm. And over to John for some additional remarks.
Yeah, Joni, you hit the nail on the head. When we started talking about this book, again, we had taught this class at Georgetown, and we found that it was very difficult, even for grad students, to have a common ground to talk about Africa, to really know the main issues. And I think also from our time, in government, people move all the time. You move accounts. You could be a China analyst one day, and the next day there's a surge and you're a Nigeria analyst. You have to get up to speed in a hurry. You could be deployed from CENTCOM to AFRICOM. And again, getting to grips with these issues, Africa is daunting. There's a lot of countries, there's a lot of conflicts. Even looking at the alphabet soup of DRC, anybody can get intimidated by that. So we wanted to break it down to the most elemental level and make sure that, even very basic, novice readers can understand and really come to grips with some of these issues.
Mm-hmm. Well, let me jump to Brittany for a moment as a person who's not currently in government. One of the challenges that I've always had as an analyst dealing with individuals who've come from other parts of the U.S. government, for example, Afghanistan or Iraq. A lot of the CT folks have come from the Middle East theater. And one of the huge differences between U.S. approaches in the Middle East and U.S. approaches in Africa is the amount of money that's available to spend on them. For example, when the Amazon mission was first stood up in Somalia, the Amazon peacekeeping mission, that's been an important part of U.S. counterterrorism strategy in East Africa, we were spending about $1 billion a year on that, supporting that effort. And I think we were spending a couple $1 billion a week in Iraq and Afghanistan during those conflicts. So we're talking about a really different toolkit, essentially, that there are a lot of things that are simply off the table when you're talking about responses in Africa. Brittany, what is your sense of the direction of U.S. policy? Currently we're spending about $3 trillion and counting on a coronavirus response. What is that going to do to our willingness to invest money in these sometimes worsening conflicts in Africa? And Brittany, that was a question to you.
Yeah, sorry about that. The mute problems, but we got it. I think it's a challenging time because if coronavirus hadn't happened, we would be having one discussion. But here we are facing a massive global pandemic, which means all of the issues that face the African continent are just going to be exacerbated, whether it's poverty, weak governance, authoritarian tendencies. All of those things are going to be exacerbated over the next, who knows, 2 years, 5 years. We probably will be seeing the effects of coronavirus for the next 10 years, maybe even longer. So I think when it comes to the United States, what's a real challenge is that the U.S. doesn't really want to, and may not actually be able to, exert some power on the continent right now. We've seen this trend of not having as much interest over the last 3 years in engaging on the continent. Once again, I think that John hit, 54 countries, 53 countries, depending on, what map you're using, the US government map or the world map, but it's a lot of different countries in a lot of different ways. So I think what becomes really important for all of us as policymakers and people who are Africa watchers and interested in this is that we need to remember that these challenges, these massive challenges, are going to be waiting for us after the coronavirus starts to level off or we start to see an afterward. So what becomes important is that we're all planning, that we're all thinking about what it means when, whether it's the US government, European governments, anyone realizes that we're going to have to start engaging with Africa again in a very, very active way. And what we've learned over the last 10 years, I think what you'll read in Jonah and John's book, is that we haven't always had a balanced approach as outside policymakers. It's been very overly militarized, focused on counterterrorism efforts. We've underfunded diplomacy and development. We haven't had a balanced approach. If we try and make lemonade out of lemons with this pandemic, it is a chance for us to rethink as policymakers about how we want to approach these massive challenges.
Brittany, can I just jump in and add something to that? I mean, I think that's an excellent point. But I think, in a sense, we have to look at this as an opportunity too. And looking at how, I think for many years, I started in government in the Clinton administration, and the way that, except for PEPFAR, which is about the only massive, I think, intervention that the USG has made, truly massive game-changing intervention, a lot of it's kind of business as usual. Now you look around, I was doing this the other day, you look at what the West writ large, all Western capitals are spending or donors are spending on the continent. You take all the PKOs, that's about $6.5 billion. You've got if you look around the continent, everything's getting worse. There are very few conflicts that we can point to outside of maybe the transition in Sudan. UNAMID might be drawn down, but every other peacekeeping mission shows no real sign of at least the need for it going away. I think, in whether it's London, Paris, Washington, wherever, we all have to be thinking a little bit more creatively about how to do more with less. And I think reshape and do kind of a zero-based review of how we're spending money. What is getting impact? We spent how much money in Somalia, and 25 years later, there's Danab is the only fighting unit that can actually have an impact. The SNA is essentially a non-functional entity. So again, this is the opportunity that I think we all have right now.
Well, I think what becomes really important about that is that we've heard the same thing again. Power Africa, trade Africa, prosper Africa. It doesn't matter. We all agree it would be great to see more trade and investment on the continent. But obviously, we need to shift that. If you, since the Clinton administration, I think Jonah and I, since the Bush administration, have been following this and seeing that, we aren't making the successes where we need to go. And I think you're absolutely right. That means a shift. It also means that instead of, always looking at China, the Gulf states, Russia, or other engagement from outsiders as a negative, I'm actually hoping this coronavirus will show us that maybe all of them will jump in and we'll see some humanitarian assistance beyond what China's just doing right now. But from the Gulf states, from China, from Russia, let's start pushing, the leaders on the continent to ask these other outside actors to get involved in ways that are more positive. It means, forgiving debt, all of those kinds of things that we need to see from some of these outside actors.
Mm-hmm. So one of the challenges, though, that I've always come up against is that U.S. politicians, diplomats, and development officials also have a very different sort of mentality than the one that is required currently, I think. All of us grew up in an era where the U.S. had an outsized influence on foreign policy in other countries. And a diplomat could show up, make a suggestion, and effectively move the needle in a country just by showing an interest. And nowadays, we have tremendous competition from China and the Gulf states, for example, who are willing to invest massive amounts of money almost instantly. When they go into a room, foreign officials know that they're going to walk out with a check. When an American official goes into a room, they know they're going to have 3 or 4 or 6 or 8 or 14 months of intense negotiations that may eventually produce some kind of benefit to them that's seriously tied up in red tape. So what can the U.S. do, particularly in pursuit of its security objectives, to be effective when we're countering the influence of rivals who have those advantages over us? It's hard, particularly when you imagine that a lot of the officials don't realize how disadvantaged they are and have this old, I don't want to call it a colonial mindset, but this hegemonic mindset, which is no longer really that appropriate. John and Jonah, do you have any, I mean, this might be beyond the capacity of the military to address, but are there strategies that can be brought into play by the military to make us more effective or at least more aware of these problems?
I mean, one thing, I'll just jump in with a couple, some anecdotes. And in my company, we do a fair bit of business across the continent. We're looking at some opportunities, and hearing feedback from ministries of defense and chiefs of defense staff. Oftentimes, I think the complaint about the U.S. is we're not listening. There's not the actual real engagement. Nobody sticks around long enough to build, a mentoring relationship, a kind of close, advisory relationship. U.S. officials tend to be in and out before they can really often build, the expertise and knowledge that they need to do something. But in general, there seems to be a mentality, and this is the perception, if not necessarily true, but the perception is that, okay, USG, the AFRICOM or whoever is going to go in, oh, here's the package, here's what we're going to give you, it's checkmark A, checkmark B, and it's not really listening about what the capability challenges are. I think if there was a little bit more robust engagement by defense attachés, and this is not to criticize the command, because I think there's some excellent people doing excellent work, but structurally, I don't think USG is set up to really be nimble enough and flexible enough to address some of these challenges, some of which are changing by the day, especially across places like the Sahel. So, I don't know what the actual functional answer is there, but it has to be a focus on nimbleness and being a bit more willing to engage and not just kind of hand out the standard answer, if that makes sense.
Well, let me push you a little further. I mean, Jonah, when you were making your opening remarks, you referenced the fact that particularly in the Horn of Africa and in the Sahel, the security situation has been worsening. We're facing increasing strikes to attack an ever widening array of bad guys. But that, of course, has tremendous costs in terms of increasing radicalization and simply lengthening the cycle of violence. This is a persistent trend. It didn't start with the Trump administration. It actually began with the Obama administration. So what are the odds of us being able to shift the needle? I mean, it's not even shifting the needle. It's really, in effect, a sea change in the way that we're asking U.S. officials to approach this. I mean, is there a possibility that we can redirect American officials towards less expensive but higher impact activities? And how do we develop the expertise to do that when, as you say, so often people are being pulled in from other regions, parachuting into Africa without the really extensive background and knowledge about the conflicts that are required to be effective on a shoestring? Are you talking about basically reorganizing the way that we do business in the State Department or in the Defense Department?
Well, I mean, I think if you look at DOD and state, I mean, these are bureaucracies that go far beyond any bureaucracy ever known to mankind. I mean, just came from London for the last 3 years, and going down to see FCO, you can get pretty much everybody in a room to talk about Africa within a couple of minutes. I mean, it's all right there. This is a small, nimble bureaucracy that actually, if it had more resources, would be quite effective on the continent. I think resources are just the issue. USG still has outsized resources compared to any other entity on the planet. I mean, we are still the hyperpower. I mean, at the end of the day, that is the case. No matter what competition from China or elsewhere is coming. So I think it does just take a mindset change in terms of, and again, let's be honest, it's going to be another administration. I mean, under this administration, I doubt we're going to see any sort of change, and beyond 2020, who knows? But there are a lot of, the beauty of Washington, there's a lot of very, very smart people working on Africa issues. And I think a lot of us who have come up through the last 15, 20 years have seen what doesn't work. I think the trick is going to be actually getting a patron at cabinet level who actually does have a care and a passion about Africa. Again, we're looking out beyond November. I have no idea if that's the case. I think that's where it starts. But you're right, structurally, USG is always going to be fighting an uphill battle. It's too big. This is a giant battleship that does not turn very quickly. And the Pentagon is a whole different beast unto itself. But the point is the low cost, high impact solutions are out there, around, again, what I focus on professionally, training and mentoring militaries. That doesn't cost a lot of money to stick with people and help them get to the point and make sure they have the equipment they need, not the equipment we want to necessarily give them all the time. It's not high tech. You don't need fast jets. You don't need drones. A lot of times it just takes guys who know how to patrol some armored vehicles and attack helicopters. I mean, if you're, again, looking at the military side of things, these are not high cost necessarily solutions. So there are opportunities out there. We just need to be more cognizant of them and make sure that they're presented in the right forums.
Let me ask you, anyone who cares to answer this. We did have a question early on in our event from a security advisor working in East and West Africa who was wondering about emerging tactics, techniques, and technologies that jihadi groups might be able to acquire in coming years. I mean, you've characterized this as not necessarily a high-tech investment on the part of the U.S. government, but we have been ambushed a couple of times by capabilities that we weren't expecting. And so the question is, what can we expect it to remain? Can we expect that U.S. engagement in the continent can remain at the level that it is, or are we going to be dealing with increasing risk to our personnel that will require more? I'm putting the squeeze on John exclusively. But
yeah, I think a couple of new things I think we've observed in past years. I think there's two kind of new trends in terms of war fighting or security in Africa. One is, yes, the use of drone technology, whether for surveillance or for actually attacking adversary forces. The other thing that's I think really important to watch is the implementation of surveillance systems, whether really complex CCTV systems in municipal areas, which African countries are increasingly purchasing. These companies like Huawei, ZTE, how are they using those to enforce security or enforce counterterrorism measures? That's new. Then also the other trend in the 2010s is really with African countries really trying to develop special forces, small forces that can use unconventional tactics and techniques, less emphasis on their conventional forces and tanks and vessels and stuff like that.
Do you see any game-changing technologies coming down the line? I mean, what would happen, for example, if Al-Shabaab acquired drones? Is that something that's a possibility in the near future? And would that change the U.S. position in Somalia?
Well, it would certainly put U.S. forces at a far more vulnerable position. And yes, I mean, I think USG would definitely have to reconsider the steps that it's taking. But to step back from USG for a minute, though, I mean, look at, I'm concerned less about American troops on the ground, which again, I think more capability needs to be built into African militaries to do these sorts of things, whether it's the French, whether it's the US, whether it's UNPKOs. African militaries are the only ones with the legitimacy to really, again, take on these conflicts and ultimately, hopefully defeat them. But if you look at the threats to these militaries, guys getting blown up in Chad, in Niger, I mean, you're talking attacks that are taking out a measurable percentage of an active duty military, which is scary. And these are not high-tech, sophisticated attacks. These are soldiers failing to put down an effective perimeter as USG, and then a lot of our African partners are.
As much of the security problem that, in terms of capacity building that the U.S. military has learned over the past couple of decades is building capacity is more than teaching Africans how to soldiers how to shoot a gun. It's about building defense institutions that can properly train, equip, and sustain forces. So, it's the military can be part of an overall picture of enforcing security, protecting civilians, but there's an institutional, there's a political level to this too that's essential to coordinate.
Yeah.
And I think just to sort of add on to that, I think that although we may not have a ton of investment from the U.S. government on the continent, we can take lessons learned from other regions. And we keep learning these same things over and over again. So I guess lessons observed, right, is the better term. But we keep seeing that exactly what Joan and John talk about in the book, about that institution building and capacity building is the way to go. I think the other piece of this is specifically speaking to crisis group, is looking for these political solutions rather than kinetic solutions. Rather than thinking we're going to shoot our way out of some of these conflicts, it's actually looking at things like dialogue, trying to really understand what the other side thinks. So one of the things at Crisis Group that we're really proud of is we talk to all sides of a conflict, and we try and understand exactly what it is that got us to where we are, and understanding, whichever bad guy we might be talking about fighting, but really understanding the motivation so that we can find pragmatic solutions to trying to end these conflicts that don't involve just putting more troops on the ground.
So let me ask you, all three of you, a question. Is the U.S. good at institution building? Do we have a track record of success at institution building in Africa? And do we have a track record of success at conflict resolution in Africa? Or are these new skills that we effectively need to acquire?
I would argue that we actually have those skills in other regions. I think when you can look at some places in Latin America, not across the board, right? It's always hard, but there are a few examples. And I think that we need to continue to take those lessons. There was the Security Governance Initiative that sort of was a short-lived thing under the Obama administration, had all the right ideas about how we take lessons learned from other regions on how to build those institutions. I think that you're right, and we haven't been very successful, or the U.S. government hasn't been very successful on the continent necessarily, but
yeah.
I mean, Bronwyn, I think I was just going to say part of the problem is something that you pointed out earlier. It's no longer a hegemonic world. In the late 80s, early 90s, the Namibia solution, South Africa, the days of Chet Crocker and Herm Cohen, and being able to walk into a room and being the big kid on the block in the post-Cold War universe, those days are over. Again, the U.S. is still the hyperpower, but there are, believe me, there's a line out the door. Whether it's in the Sahel, you're going to, obviously the French are still there, China, UAE, there's lots of different players now. And I think it takes time on target. It takes people who are going to be willing to give up years of their life to embedding themselves into a solution to really have that impact, but plus having the resource commitment behind it. And again, I don't really see a bit of the former, but not too much of the latter right now.
I think if we look at the 2010s, I mean, there are some big problems, new conflicts that have Libya, Mali, South Sudan that have been persistent that we don't have a good answer for yet. But there are a number of cases where there's been successful interventions, and we've either prevented or stopped conflict or kept political stability on. West African countries, into the Gambia, into Guinea-Bissau. And of course, there was the international intervention in 2014 to help contain Ebola outbreak. And most of the most successful cases, it was international actors supporting African-led efforts to stem the crisis. There has to be willingness among politicians, among publics, among militaries on the ground to work together for a solution. We've seen instances where, when we spot these opportunities, the U.S., other international actors can support and reinforce these efforts. But if that doesn't exist, it's much more difficult. I'd also point out that sometimes, sitting here in Washington or in any other donor capital, it's sometimes hard for us to figure out the best solution. And sometimes, I often think back at Nigeria and how the Niger Delta conflict was resolved in the late 2000s and 2009. It was basically, they granted amnesty to militant groups. There was kind of a payoff. There was a job creation program. A lot of people here in Washington didn't think this was going to work, but it's worked, and it's largely kept the peace. So I think going back to John's point about listening and learning and not trying to, and really work with local actors and support those efforts.
So that's an interesting point, John. I mean, and it's come up in our Q&A feed as well, which is that one of the real differences between U.S. approaches in the Middle East, for example, and in Africa, is the willingness and unwillingness to negotiate and engage with militant groups. A lot of American successes abroad and in the Niger Delta, as you just mentioned, have come from our willingness to talk to the enemy. And we haven't seen a lot of that in the African context. So what is the odds that we'll see greater willingness to talk to the bad guys moving forward, understanding that it can be a big part of our success?
One thing, Brittany, I think you're going to have some excellent perspectives on this. I mean, one thing that I see, though, across the continent, what kind of scares me, I mean, when you look at the Sahel, when you look at northern Mozambique, which really scares the hell out of me right now, there's not a lot of understanding of actually who the enemy is. I mean, the enemy changes on a day-to-day basis. I mean, if you look at, again, the groups in northern Mozambique, they almost strike me more as nihilists than anything else. I mean, these are not rebels who want to capture the capital. This is not, the RUF or, again, Charles Taylor. We're dealing with groups that have much more, I think, nuanced motivations, oftentimes, again, criminal motivations. If you look at Central African Republic, there's no real, essentially, you've got almost 16 criminal groups that just want to divide up the country and get rich off the spoils. And you can look at them certainly through that lens. A lot has been made of Islamist groups across the Sahel, but again, how many of guys participating in these conflicts are actually motivated by kind of Islamist motivations? So again, in Mali, I know the Malian government has talked to some groups, but not others. Again, Brittany, I'd like to hear your perspective here, but I think my big question is what do these guys want? Who is the enemy? What do they want? And how do we actually find out what they want when even African governments oftentimes don't know?
Yeah, so a couple things. Like, one, I think you rely on incredible organizations like Crisis Group that are out there in the field talking to, maybe not directly talking to the bad guys at some points because, we don't have access, there's security issues, but talking to the folks who are in the field on the ground. And that's sort of where that's our bread and butter. But, I think you're absolutely right. You think about a group like Al-Shabaab, and the U.S. response, this over-militarized response, there's a huge argument that the success of Al-Shabaab has been because of the U.S. government response, that we've seen, this over-militarized thing has led to easier recruitment and other things around. So I think one of the first areas we need to start is, that basic principle of the do no harm principle. We need to take a look at these areas where we are active and making sure that we're not making things worse. And that's sort of like a first starting point. But I think when it comes to talking to the other sides, you're totally right. It's not a blanket thing of that we should make sure that we're going to listen to, we're not going to necessarily do what the other side says because they may be a criminal organization, but we need to at least understand it. And in some places, right, like Central African Republic, you're absolutely right. So the solutions ends up being those things that are not very sexy. It ends up being about economic development. It ends up being about long-term approaches to institution building and good governance and the things that are not exciting. It also means that the U.S. Congress and the appropriations process can't pigeonhole policymakers to pretend that there's terrorism so that they can get funding. I think that's what we've seen over the last, 15 years, is that everyone's desperately trying to pretend that there's a terrorist organization in their country because at least then they'll get U.S. government funding. And I think, as a former policymaker, I constantly tried to think of ways that we could connect to the places where there was funding, or there was, real money coming from Congress. And so I think that's one of the other things we really need to focus on so that we don't have to identify a terrorist group in order to be able to
all love to see these implemented. But the fact is the U.S. wasn't able to build up a stockpile of needed medical supplies here in the United States. And what I'm constantly asking myself in this day and age is the United States the best actor to be building institutions in Africa? We don't have the trade motivation that China has or the Gulf states have. It's not our backyard. We have less interest in engaging in Africa than many of these other nations, and we're less willing to spend resources. And we know the nations less well than the Chinese and the Arabs do. So what is it? Is the United States the right actor or not? We have great skills that we can bring to bear on the African continent. But, when we look at Africa from an economic perspective, the first thing that we do is to say, what are the industries where we're most competitive? Where do we have a competitive edge? And I'm not sure that we've identified as policy analysts what the US competitive edge is as far as security in Africa goes. The easy question is it's whack-a-mole killing bad guys with our great sophisticated technology. But can we do better than that? I mean, I would really like to see a strategy that's focused on what we can really contribute to Africa based on what our hard interests there are.
This is bedeviled, all of us Africa watchers since the 1960s. I mean, let's be honest, this is something that Africa has always had to struggle against in terms of, what is on the horizon tomorrow. I mean, I think there's a few things that, the points that we would make, kind of in writing the book. Why should we care about Africa? I mean, one, I think any place where you've got a large swath of, ungoverned territory is kind of a bad term, but places where, IS and AQ affiliated groups operate more or less at will and are more or less safe havens. I mean, I think that needs to concern pretty much anyone. Yeah. Second of all, anyone looking at the demography of the continent, the projections of 2 billion in 2050, 4 billion in 2100. Again, these are going to go all over the place, but they do keep creeping upwards. I mean, we are still seeing a continent that is going to be significantly affected by climate change, by mega cities like Lagos and Kinshasa. How they're going to cope with that. I mean, frankly, there's a moral component, but there's also going to be a component of looking at national interest in terms of migration, and then also even in terms of markets. I mean, there are going to be absolutely tremendous, at least in terms of population size, could be potential stupendous markets out there. And so I think these are the we have to be thinking a couple of steps ahead. We can't look at something tomorrow and say, oh yeah, no, Africa, we don't need to do it tomorrow. But a week from now, or a year from now, or 5 years from now, these are the sort of considerations that a strategic administration is going to take into account. And again, I think it's this lack of strategy and this lack of, and again, Jonah has made this point several times, we try to draw Africa into the broader policy and security consensus and discussion. I mean, this is something that I do think has been lacking through the years. And yeah, I mean, again, Brittany, Jonah, I'm sure you certainly have other takes on it, but it is always going to be a challenge. I mean, let's be honest about that.
I'm going to answer unless Jonah or Brittany want to jump in.
One of the things I think that we are good at, and we saw different, I think over the last 15 years, we've seen different U.S. government agencies try and do it, is, we can help some of these countries to negotiate better deals with China. We can help them to negotiate better deals with any outside actor. That is something we actually are good at. Whether it's putting advisors right in there to help them negotiate those deals so that we're not seeing countries just burdened and suffocated by huge amounts of debt based on those deals. That's something I think we are good at. I think you're absolutely right that we need to focus on some of the aspects that the U.S. is good at and really, narrow in on those and invest in them. And that's one example.
That's a great example. I actually really like that. But I do want to refer back to the Q&A because one of the questions that came up was, in Sudan and Ethiopia, for example, we've seen a sea change in the political environment. The overthrow of authoritarian regimes that have held power for decades. And the U.S. had nothing to do with it. We were really on the fringes. And I think the question was basically, are we better off trying to have influence from a very great distance as opposed to getting in there and trying to influence events?
As those of us who have been working on those countries for a long time, I would argue that we didn't have some, maybe we weren't the ones holding things, but we have been talking with governments and supporting different ideas and promoting these things. I mean, I think that everyone in the U.S. government was waiting for Bashir to fall. Yes, the U.S. government wasn't the one doing it, but that's exactly why it's great. Like, we don't want an outside power in there making a revolution happen. You want it coming from the streets, and you want those ideals that the U.S. has been pushing for, strong civil society, open, public dialogue and strong journalism. You want all those things to be coming through. We don't need to be the ones who did it, but it's great that we can be ones that can help promote it. And, whether it's sanctions relief in Sudan, or it's helping with, now that things are changing in Ethiopia, how can we help with the elections? How can we help with, monitoring, evaluating the elections so that we can see, the people can start to have
Africans and others from around the world to America and help influence ideas. And again, the U.S. always, and I'm proud to say this, is an ideas influencer. I mean, this is, we do bring our ideals to the table in everything that we do. And again, if you look at, and I haven't really looked in depth, but if you look at the people involved in Ethiopia and Sudan, the ones that we engage with long term, these are ways through kind of soft power initiatives that we do build a great deal of influence. And like I said, you can't see it tomorrow, but 5-10 years down the road, you're going to be surprised at who you know and who you've trained.
Yeah. I mean, I think that that's the kind of thinking that we need to be focused on, most definitely, because, General Ward has commented in our section that basically a lot of the things that we are talking about now, and he says specifically adding value, do no harm, sustain security and engagement, listening organization, building partner capacity. None of these are new ideas. I mean, these are the things that AFRICOM was talking about when it was stood up 12 years ago, effectively. And if we didn't get it right 12 years ago, I think the odds of our managing to get it right now in this political environment are fewer. So these new ideas are really needed. So we're really getting close in on time. But one question that came up that was really interesting is regarding China. One of our adversaries, if I'm allowed to say that, on the continent right now. And the question was effectively, if because of the commodity downturn, and obviously extraction is a big motivator for China to be engaged in Africa, because of the commodity downturn, is there a likelihood that China will actually pull back in the wake of the coronavirus, and will that create an opportunity for America to re-engage on the continent? Any thoughts? I thought that was a great question.
Yeah, I think the China role is important. I would say, and I don't think China is necessarily seen as an adversary, but China does drive economic trends in Africa. Goods from China. You're going to see less imports of raw materials from Africa. Also, there's kind of a supply side issue in Africa as well, as borders are being closed, as mining concerns are being drawn down because of the virus. So, watch the commodity picture. And when there's less imports of African goods, you're going to see less government revenue in Africa. And then I think someone mentioned debt relief. Well, where's our debt relief? And some of that's held by other governments, international institutions, some of that's privately held. And that's a complicated issue, but that's one to watch as well. That's going to make a big difference in how this looks going forward.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
I think one of the things that's really important, Bronwyn, that you're hitting on is, like, as policymakers and as someone outside the government, and those of us who are outside, and even those that are in, let's not be tolerant of the same old policies. I think that we all need to push back on those things. We need to push back and say, like, if we've learned anything over the last 10, 20, 60, 50, whatever years, it is what's working and what isn't. Let's not be tolerant of those things anymore. It's time for a new approach to some of these things. We need to rethink how we've engaged. So I think you're right on. Like, and that's all of us, right? Like, whoever's watching, whoever's interested enough to sit with us, online for an hour today, like, it's us who have to come up with those new ideas.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And it's a hard time to do it in the middle of the coronavirus crisis. And, I have to say, my view is that coronavirus is sort of a test run for climate change. Because, I mean, that is another global crisis that's sweeping down on us. It's going to deplete budgets across the globe. And how we, as the United States, respond to coronavirus in Africa is probably a good indication of how we're going to respond to climate change as those pressures on us ramp up. So I think this is a real opportunity to set the stage for the future. And if we do it right, it could be very important and very meaningful. But if we do it wrong, I think it's only going to get worse.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and also we shouldn't, throw the baby out with the bathwater. I mean, there are things that the U.S. does extremely well on the continent. The Peace Corps. I mean, when serving on the continent and in South Africa, Cote d'Ivoire, traveling around a great deal. I mean, the one thing that comes up time and again, from governments, from people, appreciation for the Peace Corps volunteers and what they do. But yet, look what kind of funding it gets across the continent. PEPFAR, I can't tell you the number of people in South Africa that said, George Bush goes to heaven because of PEPFAR. It's the intervention, the effect that we had there. Is there another PEPFAR on there? Is there a PEPFAR for education, which is another thing that I think definitely needs to be looked at. The U.S. is capable of bold ideas in a way that very few countries are, and we have the resources to back them up if we have those bold ideas. So I think, Brittany, getting to what you were saying, I think we all need to continue both to be, fine-tuning, but also to be bold, not to be afraid to push out ideas that may seem unrealistic, or, oh, this is the way the Pentagon has always done it, or this is the way state has always done it. Let's throw that out the window and look at the ideal world and how we actually would program in a better system and a better setup.
I think one thing the book makes the case for, and that reinforces these comments, is we have to be quick to spot opportunities to reinforce positive trends. Each chapter of the book, whether it's conflict resolution or about religious extremism or about civil military relations, there's a checklist of an analyst checklist at the end of each chapter of key things to look for and to focus on, and trying to understand what the emerging trend is. Is there an opportunity there? We talk about militaries. Some of these militaries are making the situation worse. Human rights abuses, threatening civilian rule and corruption. And, where are the opportunities? Where are the actors that are?
Yep. All right. I have to say we're closing in on the end of our time, but I personally, throughout my own career, have been very frustrated with the U.S. refusal to engage a wider range of actors as part of the solution. In Somalia, for example, Al-Shabaab, it has a linkage to Al-Qaeda, but it also delivers services on the ground that the government is incapable of providing. If we can't recognize that and capitalize on that, it's very hard to see how we're going to come to a solution in that country. That's only one example out of many that we could draw. And so part of it, I think, is being less ideological, but also more focused, frankly, from my perspective, more focused on the budget. We need to have policy ideas about Africa that are consistent with our willingness to spend. And so far, we haven't done that. We've got a lot of grandiose ideas that have not panned out some of the time because we haven't been willing to fund them properly. And these are really simple. I mean, as many people on the Q&A have pointed out, this isn't rocket science. Aligning policy ideas with your budget is something that we should all be doing as part of our government 101 efforts. And it's disappointing to me that we haven't managed that for so many years. So we are at 9:56. We're going to be closing very shortly, and I'm going to give you an opportunity to make any last remarks that you'd like to make before we have to close. Jonah, do you want to start?
I'd just say, these are tough issues. We're going through a period of, it's going to be continued change more than staying the same. Hopefully our book helps the reader zero in on what's important, what's really critical to watch, even though there's so much to do and be interested in and to read about. But, I think we cite over 700 sources. So if there's a topic that's of interest to the reader, we definitely direct you to some other great resources to look at.
Excellent. John?
Yeah, again, we wrote this book to hopefully develop a new cadre, a new generation of Africanists and people who can just get started. I mean, everything that we're talking about today, I hope that 20 years down the road, we're not having the same conversations, that we build a cadre especially within government, of people who really get into Africa and want to stick with it their whole careers. We all know them, but it's a small, hard core. I'd like to see that core grow a little bit bigger. And again, hopefully our book will make some contribution to that effort. So, and that's what we need to really change the discussion and the narrative around the continent.
Absolutely. Brittany.
Yeah, I mean, I'll start with like, a little plug for the book, because, that's what this is. And that is that, even for those of us who have been covering Africa for longer, it is a great reminder. You forget about, right, I forgot about like those clan dynamics, or I forgot about that part of history, because with 53 countries, it's pretty hard to have a good understanding of all of it. And so I would say that, it's a great place to sort of just refresh some of those. But, like I said earlier, I think this, and Bronwyn, you've hit on it, like this pandemic, it's going to leave some massive challenges, and let's be ready. I mean, let's be ready, whether this administration, the next administration, if they're not able to focus on it, I think that this is our chance as policymakers to try and think about how we can have a more creative approach in the future.
Absolutely. No, I found the book tremendously useful. I really thank you, John and Jonah, for writing it. It's fantastic to have this resource available. Once more, it's bloomsbury.com. It's on sale. Go get it. Don't go to Amazon. And bad things are going to happen to me for saying that. Someone is watching. But bloomsbury.com. Please get the book. Loved having you today, Brittany, John, Jonah. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you so much to everyone in the audience. Questions were amazing. We really appreciate your interventions, and we hope to see you soon. Bye.
Thank you, Bronwyn.
Thanks so much.